The rain hammered against the windows of the black limousine as it crawled through the neon-lit streets of Manhattan. Inside, Victoria Sterling reclined against butter-soft leather, her perfectly manicured fingers scrolling through her phone. She was 43, impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit that cost more than most people earned in 3 months, and she sat with the posture of someone who had never doubted her place at the top. Her company, Sterling Tech Solutions, had just been valued at $12 billion. She was untouchable. Or so she believed. In the driver's seat, separated by a sheet of tinted glass, sat Marcus Thompson. He was 51, with graying temples, and the kind of quiet dignity that came from enduring storms most people never faced. He wore the standard black uniform of a professional driver, pressed and immaculate despite the long hours. His dark hands gripped the steering wheel with practiced ease as he navigated the slick streets. Victoria pressed the intercom button. Her voice came through cold and clipped. "The airport. Don't take Broadway. Traffic is insufferable tonight." "Yes, ma'am," Marcus replied, his accent carrying the faint musicality of someone who had learned English alongside other languages. "I will take the tunnel route." Victoria's lips curled into the faintest smirk. The way he pronounced certain words, the slight hesitation before responding at all confirmed what she already believed. He was just a driver, competent enough to navigate city streets, but nothing more. She had seen hundreds like him. People who served, who opened doors, who existed in the background of her stratospheric life. "Do you understand the urgency of tomorrow's schedule?" she asked, not looking up from her phone. "Yes, ma'am. 7 in the morning departure. And you comprehend how critical this trip is?" There was a pause. "I understand it is very important business." She heard the slight strain in his voice, the careful selection of words. It amused her in a cruel way. This was her world boardrooms and billion-dollar deals, private jets and power lunches with senators. What could someone like him possibly understand about the weight she carried? "Just drive," she said, dismissing him as one might dismiss a servant. Marcus said nothing. He had learned long ago that silence was often the wisest response. He had learned many things over his 51 years, lessons carved into his soul by loss and reinvention. But Victoria Sterling knew none of this. To her, he was invisible in all the ways that mattered. What she didn't know, what she couldn't possibly fathom, as she sat there in her cocoon of privilege, was that in less than 48 hours, this man, she dismissed so casually, would become the only thing standing between her and complete professional annihilation. The man she had just mocked would save her career, her company, and a $2 billion deal that hung by the thinnest thread. And when that moment came, when she stood frozen in a conference room in Brussels while everything she had built teetered on collapse, she would finally see him. Really see him. And nothing in her carefully constructed world would ever be the same. The Sterling Tech Solutions deal had been 2 years in the making. Victoria had personally orchestrated every element of this acquisition, a merger with Titan Global Industries that would create the largest cross-continental technology consortium in history. $2 billion. 15,000 employees across 4 continents. It would cement her legacy, validate every sacrifice she had made climbing to the top. The business press had already written glowing profiles. Her board of directors watched with barely contained excitement. Even her competitors had grudgingly acknowledged the brilliance of the strategy. But brilliance only mattered if you could close the deal. The partner companies came from 7 different countries. Each brought their own legal teams, their own cultural expectations, their own agendas. The negotiation table would host executives from Germany, France, Japan, Russia, China, Brazil, and the United Arab Emirates. It was the kind of high-wire diplomatic dance that required perfect coordination, flawless communication, and absolutely no margin for error. Victoria had hired the best. A team of professional interpreters, each specializing in specific language pairs. Legal experts fluent in international contract law. Cultural consultants who understood the nuanced differences between how business was conducted in Shanghai versus Sao Paulo. She had spent nearly $300,000 on translation and interpretation services alone. She sat in her corner office on the 47th floor, reviewing the final documentation. Her assistant, Jennifer, stood nervously by the door. "Everything is confirmed?" Victoria asked without looking up. "Yes. The interpreters will meet us at the Brussels office. Hotel accommodations are arranged. The car service in Europe is—" "I don't care about the car service." Victoria's voice could cut glass. "I care about making sure we have no communication breakdowns. No misunderstandings. This deal dies if someone misinterprets a decimal point or misses the nuance in a clause. Everything is triple-checked," Jennifer assured her. "You'll have simultaneous interpretation in German, French, Mandarin, Japanese, Russian, Portuguese, and Arabic. Victoria finally looked up. And the backup translators? On standby. Good. She returned to her documents. Tell Thompson to have the car ready at 6 tomorrow morning. I want to beat traffic to the airport. Jennifer hesitated. The driver? Ma'am. The service in Brussels will provide. I want consistency. Thompson knows my schedule. He comes with us. It wasn't loyalty that motivated this decision. Victoria simply hated explaining her preferences to new people. Marcus Thompson had been her driver for 6 months. He knew when she wanted silence, he never attempted small talk, and he was always exactly on time. He was, in her mind, adequately trained. Like a well-functioning appliance. Jennifer nodded and left. Victoria returned to her spreadsheets, calculating profit margins and market share projections. Somewhere below, in the underground garage, Marcus Thompson was methodically cleaning the limousine, checking tire pressure, ensuring every detail was perfect. He had his own preparations to make, his own thoughts about the days ahead. But Victoria never wondered what those thoughts might be. In her world, drivers didn't think. They simply drove. The next morning arrived gray and cold. Marcus had the limousine idling outside Victoria's apartment building at precisely 6 o'clock. She emerged from the lobby in a black cashmere coat, a leather briefcase in one hand, phone in the other. She didn't acknowledge him as he opened the door. She didn't say good morning. She simply got in and immediately began taking calls. Marcus closed the door with practiced gentleness and returned to the driver's seat. As he merged into early morning traffic, he could hear fragments of her conversations through the intercom. Tell the Germans we're not budging on the intellectual property clauses. Yes, I know what their counsel said. I don't care if it's culturally unusual, this is business, not a tea party. Her voice carried the absolute certainty of someone who had never truly failed. Marcus had known people like this before, in another life. People who believed the universe bent to their will because, so far, it always had. He felt neither anger nor judgment. He simply recognized the pattern. They arrived at the private terminal of JFK Airport 45 minutes later. As Marcus unloaded her luggage, Victoria was already striding toward the waiting jet, her phone still pressed to her ear. She didn't thank him. She didn't even glance back. Ma'am, he called out. She stopped, turned slightly, her expression impatient. Your boarding documents, he said, holding out a leather folder. She snatched it from his hand. Stay with the car. We land in Brussels at 11 local time. I'll need you at the hotel by noon. I will be there, Marcus said quietly. Something in his tone made her pause for just a fraction of a second. But then her phone rang again, and she was gone, disappearing up the stairs of the jet without another word. Marcus watched the plane until it disappeared into the overcast sky. Then he drove the limousine to long-term parking and caught his own commercial flight to Brussels. He had 8 hours to sit with his thoughts, to remember things he had spent years trying to forget, and to prepare for what he suspected was coming. Because Marcus Thompson knew something Victoria Sterling didn't. He knew that the world was far more fragile than powerful people ever imagined. And he knew that sometimes, in the space between languages, entire empires could crumble. The Palais de la Nation Hotel in Brussels was everything Victoria expected: marble floors, crystal chandeliers, staff who moved with choreographed precision. Her suite overlooked the Grand Place, the medieval square glowing in the late afternoon light. She had 3 hours before the first dinner meeting with the international partners. Just enough time to review her notes, make a dozen phone calls, and compose herself for the performance ahead. Marcus brought her luggage up himself, refusing the hotel porter's assistance. Victoria was at the window, her back to him, when he entered. Put everything in the bedroom, she said without turning. Then make sure the car is ready for 7. We're dining at Restaurant Claude. Yes, ma'am. He moved quietly through the suite, placing her bags with care. Victoria heard him but didn't watch. He was furniture to her. Functional and forgettable. Thompson, she said suddenly. He appeared in the doorway. Yes, ma'am? There will be 8 of us at dinner. Conversation will be in English, but some of the partners may slip into their native languages. The interpreters will be present, but I expect you to simply wait with the car. Stay ready. These dinners can end early or run very late. I understand. Do you? She finally turned to look at him, her gaze sharp and assessing. Do you understand what's at stake here? This isn't driving some executive to a golf course. This is the most important negotiation of my career. Marcus met her eyes calmly. I understand that you have worked very hard for this opportunity. Something about his response irritated her, though she couldn't identify exactly what. Maybe it was his composure. Maybe it was the way he stood there, unintimidated, as if they were equals engaging in conversation rather than employer and employee. "Just be ready," she said dismissively, turning back to the window. "I will be." He left quietly. Victoria returned to her notes, pushing away the odd feeling that had flickered through her. She had a deal to close. Nothing else mattered. That evening's dinner was a careful dance of diplomacy. The partners arrived dressed in expensive suits, speaking English with varying degrees of fluency. Victoria's interpreters sat discreetly at a nearby table, ready to assist when needed. The conversation flowed through market analyses, regulatory frameworks, and projected timelines. Everyone was polite. Everyone was cautious. These were the opening moves in a very expensive game of chess. Marcus waited with the car, as instructed. He stood in the cool Brussels night, watching well-dressed people come and go from the restaurant. He thought about his own dinners in places like this, decades ago, when he had been Dr. Marcus Thompson, recipient of the MacArthur Fellowship, the linguist whom universities competed to recruit. When he had dined with ambassadors and scholars. When his voice had mattered in rooms where decisions were made. That felt like someone else's life now. And in many ways, it was. The dinner ended at 11. Victoria emerged looking satisfied, flanked by 2 German executives who were laughing at something she had said. Marcus opened the car door. She got in without acknowledgement. The Germans bid her good night in their language, and she responded in English, her tone warm but her words carefully neutral. As Marcus drove back to the hotel, Victoria allowed herself a small smile. The first evening had gone well. The partners were engaged. The interpreters had performed flawlessly. Tomorrow would bring the real work, the detailed negotiation sessions where every word would be measured and every clause would be debated. But tonight, she could feel the momentum building. Everything was going according to plan. She didn't notice Marcus glancing in the rearview mirror. She didn't see the quiet sadness in his eyes, the look of someone who recognized dangerous overconfidence. He had seen this before. The conviction that preparation could control chaos. The belief that expensive solutions could solve any problem. He said nothing. He simply drove through the illuminated streets, taking her back to her golden suite, while he returned to his modest hotel near the airport. Tomorrow would reveal what it would reveal, and Marcus Thompson, who had already lost everything once, was prepared for whatever came. The main negotiation session began at 9 the next morning, in a glass-walled conference room, on the top floor of the Titan Global Industries European headquarters. The space was designed to impress 360-degree views of Brussels, a table that could seat 30 people, and state-of-the-art presentation technology. Victoria arrived 15 minutes early, as was her habit. She liked to claim the space first, to establish psychological dominance. The partners began arriving. Werner Hoffmann led the German contingent, 3 stern-faced men in identical dark suits, who spoke to each other in rapid German. From France came Isabelle Marchand, elegant and sharp-eyed, flanked by 2 lawyers who looked like they had stepped from a Parisian fashion magazine. The Japanese delegation arrived exactly on time, led by Hiroshi Tanaka, a man whose politeness was legendary but whose negotiating skills were ruthless. Viktor Petrov represented Russian interests, a former oligarch's legal counsel who smiled often but revealed nothing. The Chinese team, headed by Chen Wei, brought an interpreter of their own, a young woman who translated their Mandarin into crisp English. From Brazil came Roberto Silva, casual in manner but brilliant in strategy. And finally, Ahmed al-Rashid from the Emirates, impeccably dressed and carrying generations of trading wisdom in his blood. Victoria's interpreters took their positions. Each wore headphones and held tablets, ready to provide real-time translation. The technology was supposed to be seamless. Simultaneous interpretation, whispered into earpieces. Allowing everyone to participate as if language barriers didn't exist. The first 2 hours went smoothly. Victoria presented her vision for the merger, laying out profit projections and market expansion strategies. The partners asked questions. The interpreters translated. Everything functioned exactly as planned. Then they broke for lunch. When they reconvened at 2 in the afternoon, the atmosphere had shifted. The partners had spent lunch talking among themselves, comparing notes, identifying concerns. Now came the hard part: negotiating the actual terms of the merger. The equity splits, the board representation, the operational control. Werner Hoffmann began speaking in German, his voice forceful. The interpreter translated. We have concerns about the proposed governance structure. The German division represents 37% of projected revenue, yet you allocate us only 23% board representation. Victoria responded smoothly. Board representation isn't proportional to revenue. It's based on strategic value and operational integration. Isabelle Marchand interjected in French, which was translated. Perhaps you could clarify what strategic value means in this context. The discussion intensified. Partners began speaking over each other. The Japanese delegation made points in Japanese. The Russians responded in Russian. The Chinese team consulted among themselves in Mandarin. The interpreters worked frantically, but the technology that had seemed so sophisticated suddenly felt inadequate. There were delays. Mistranslations. Moments where context was lost. Wait, Viktor Petrov said, switching to English. The translator just said, optional compliance, but I believe the French delegation said, mandatory compliance. Which is it? The French interpreter looked flustered. There was overlap in the audio feed. Could Madame Marchand repeat? Isabelle looked annoyed. She repeated her statement in French, but more rapidly, her frustration evident. The interpreter struggled. She says, the mandatory elements of compliance must be, or possibly should be. I'm not catching all of the legal terminology. Victoria felt the first flutter of concern. Everyone, please. One at a time. Let the translators work. But it was like trying to control a wildfire. Chen Wei said something in Mandarin that made his entire team shake their heads. The Chinese interpreter translated, Mr. Chen questions whether the intellectual property protections are sufficient under international law. Roberto Silva responded in Portuguese, speaking quickly to his lawyer. His words weren't immediately translated. When they were, the translation seemed incomplete. Ahmed Al-Rashid leaned forward. I believe there is confusion about what was just said regarding IP rights. Can we have that clarified? The interpreters consulted with each other, their voices overlapping. One of them removed his headphones, speaking urgently to his colleague. Victoria saw them shaking their heads. Is there a problem? She asked, her voice tight. The lead interpreter, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses, looked up apologetically. Ma'am, we're having technical difficulties with the simultaneous feed. When multiple people speak at once, the system can't process. Then we'll speak one at a time, Victoria said firmly. Everyone, please. Let's establish an order. But the damage was done. The partners were no longer speaking to Victoria. They were speaking to each other, in their own languages, creating a cacophony of German and French and Russian and Mandarin and Portuguese and Arabic and Japanese. The interpreters were overwhelmed. Pieces of conversation were translated, but the full context was lost. And in the gaps between languages, trust began to erode. Werner Hoffmann stood abruptly, speaking angry German to Isabelle Marchand. She responded in sharp French. The interpreters scrambled to translate, but by the time they did, Viktor Petrov was arguing with Chen Wei, and nobody was sure what the argument was actually about. Stop, Victoria's voice cut through the chaos. Everyone, please. Let's take a 15-minute break. The partners filed out, many still arguing with their own teams. Victoria stood alone in the conference room, her hands gripping the back of a chair. Jennifer appeared at her side, looking worried. Can we get better interpreters? Victoria asked quietly. These are the best in Europe, Jennifer said. The problem isn't their skill, it's the simultaneous nature. When everyone speaks at once, in multiple languages, across multiple cultural contexts. Find a solution, Victoria ordered. We have 20 hours before this deal, either closes or dies. Figure it out. Jennifer nodded and hurried away. Victoria remained in the conference room, staring out at the Brussels skyline. For the first time in her career, she felt something she rarely experienced. Genuine fear. The deal was slipping away, drowning in a sea of mistranslation and miscommunication. And she had no idea how to save it. Downstairs, in the parking garage, Marcus Thompson sat in the limousine, reading a worn paperback in Arabic. He had been waiting for 5 hours. He suspected he would be waiting many more. The afternoon session was a disaster. Without the simultaneous translation system, they tried sequential translation. Each speaker would pause after every sentence to allow interpretation. But this made the negotiation painfully slow. What should have taken 2 hours stretched toward 4. Tempers frayed. Partners checked their watches. The careful diplomacy of the morning had evaporated, replaced by impatience and suspicion. By 7 in the evening, they had made almost no progress. The equity structure remained unresolved. The intellectual property clauses were contested by 3 different delegations. And most critically, the timeline for implementation had become a point of bitter disagreement. Hiroshi Tanaka spoke in careful English, his Japanese too complex for adequate translation. If we cannot agree on these fundamental points, perhaps we should reconsider whether this merger serves anyone's interests. It was the nightmare scenario. The Japanese delegation, which controlled critical Asian markets, was preparing to walk away. If they left, the entire deal would collapse. The other partners would follow. $2 billion, 2 years of work, Victoria's entire reputation, all of it would evaporate. Mr. Tanaka, Victoria said, her voice steady despite the panic rising in her chest. I understand your frustration, but I believe we're closer than we think. We simply need to find a way to communicate more effectively. Communication is not our only problem, Werner Hoffman interjected in heavily accented English. There are fundamental philosophical differences about how this company should operate. Perhaps, Isabelle Marchand added. The problem is that this merger was conceived by Americans for Americans, and the rest of us are merely expected to comply. The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Victoria felt the room tilting. She had lost control. Everything she had built, every strategy she had deployed, was crumbling because they couldn't understand each other. Not just the words, the deeper meanings, the cultural assumptions, the unspoken expectations that live between languages. I propose we adjourn for tonight, Viktor Petrov said. Meet again tomorrow with clearer heads. It was surrender disguised as diplomacy. Victoria knew that if they left this room now, they would never return. People would make phone calls. Board members would apply pressure. By morning, the deal would be dead. 1 hour, she said desperately. Give me 1 more hour. Let me see if I can resolve these communication issues. The partners exchanged glances. Ahmed al-Rashid finally nodded. 1 hour. But Miss Sterling, I must be honest, I am not optimistic. They agreed to reconvene at 9 o'clock. Victoria stood in the empty conference room after they left, her mind racing. Jennifer approached cautiously. The interpreters can't solve this, Victoria said quietly. They're excellent at translating words. But they don't understand the business deeply enough to translate meaning. What if we delayed? Jennifer suggested. Postponed for a few days while we brought in specialists? These people came from 7 countries. They cleared their schedules. If we delay, they'll see it as weakness. The deal dies. Victoria pressed her fingers to her temples. I need someone who understands all of these languages at a native level. Someone who can think in multiple cultural frameworks simultaneously. Someone who can translate not just words but intent. That person doesn't exist, Jennifer said gently. Victoria looked out at the Brussels skyline, at the lights beginning to glow in the darkness. Then I'm finished, she whispered. She rode down in the elevator alone, her reflection staring back at her from the polished doors. She looked composed, professional, in control. She was none of those things. She was falling, and there was nothing to grab onto. The parking garage was cold and echoing. Marcus stood by the limousine, opening the door as she approached. She got in without speaking. He closed the door and returned to the driver's seat. Where to, ma'am? The hotel, she said. Then, after a pause, no. Just drive. Anywhere. Marcus nodded and pulled out into the Brussels evening. He drove through the old city, past medieval buildings and modern shops, through neighborhoods where people were having ordinary Friday nights, eating dinner, and walking dogs, and laughing with friends. Victoria stared out the window, seeing none of it. After 20 minutes of silence, she spoke. Do you know what I've sacrificed for this company? Marcus glanced in the rearview mirror but said nothing. Everything, Victoria continued, her voice distant. My marriage. My relationship with my daughter. Every friendship. Every moment of peace. I built this company from nothing. And in 1 hour, it's all going to disappear because people can't understand each other. Sometimes, Marcus said quietly, understanding is more than language. What would you know about it? The words came out sharper than she intended. She was lashing out, she knew, but she couldn't stop herself. You drive a car. You don't know what it's like to stand in a room where billions of dollars hang on whether someone interprets a clause correctly. Marcus was silent for a long moment. Then he said, You are right, ma'am. I am just a driver. The words should have satisfied her need to maintain the hierarchy between them. Instead, they made her feel somehow smaller. She stared out at the unfamiliar streets, feeling utterly alone. Take me back to the hotel, she said finally. Yes, ma'am. They drove in silence. When they arrived, Marcus opened her door. She stood on the sidewalk, not quite ready to go inside and face the avalanche of phone calls that awaited her. Thompson, she said suddenly. Yes, ma'am? Have you ever lost everything you worked for? He met her eyes. In the dim light from the hotel entrance, his face was unreadable. Yes, he said simply. I have. What did you do? I learned that what we build is not always what matters most. It was a strange answer. Victoria wanted to ask what he meant, but her phone was ringing. She walked away, answering the call from her board chair, preparing to explain the inexplicable. Marcus watched her go, then drove the car to the hotel's underground parking. He sat in the driver's seat for a long time, his hands resting on the steering wheel, his mind traveling back through the years to the man he used to be. Dr. Marcus Thompson had been considered one of the brightest linguistic minds of his generation. Fluent in 9 languages by the time he was 30. A PhD in sociolinguistics from Harvard. Research positions at Oxford and the Sorbonne. He had specialized in the intersection of language and diplomacy, studying how meaning transformed as it crossed cultural boundaries. His work had been revolutionary, showing how peace treaties succeeded or failed not because of what was written, but because of what was understood between the lines. He had been married to Sarah, a doctor with Médecins Sans Frontières. They had a daughter, Lily, who had inherited her father's gift for languages. They had lived in 7 different countries, following Sarah's humanitarian work. Marcus had consulted for the United Nations, for multinational corporations facing exactly the kind of communication breakdowns that Victoria was experiencing now. He had been sought after, celebrated, successful. Then came the accident. Sarah and Lily, driving back from a medical clinic in rural Uganda, a truck that lost control on a mountain road. Sarah died instantly. Lily lived for 3 days before her injuries overwhelmed her. She was 14 years old. Marcus had been in Geneva, delivering a keynote address at a conference, when he got the call. He flew to Uganda, but by the time he arrived, Lily was gone. He buried his wife and daughter in Sarah's hometown in Virginia, and something fundamental inside him broke. He couldn't return to his work. Every word he had written about communication and understanding suddenly felt meaningless. He had spent his life studying how to bridge divides between people, and he hadn't been there to save the 2 people he loved most. The academic world tried to be patient. Universities offered sabbaticals. Colleagues reached out. But Marcus couldn't find his way back. He left linguistics behind. He moved to New York and took the first job that required nothing of his mind, driving cars for wealthy people who barely looked at him. For 7 years, he had existed in this quiet exile. He spoke when spoken to. He drove where directed. He had 9 languages locked inside his head and used exactly one of them, enough to understand orders. Victoria Sterling was not the first client who had treated him as invisible. She wasn't even the rudest. She was simply another person who saw a black man in a driver's uniform and made assumptions about what he could possibly know or understand. He didn't blame her for it. The world taught people to make such assumptions, and people who succeeded in that world rarely questioned what they had learned. But tonight, sitting in the underground parking garage, Marcus felt something shifting inside him. He thought about Victoria's face, the way her certainty had cracked. He thought about her question. Have you ever lost everything you worked for? He thought about that conference room full of people who couldn't understand each other, and a deal worth billions dying because translation technology couldn't capture nuance. He had spent 7 years hiding from who he was. Maybe it was time to stop hiding. At 8:50 the next morning, Victoria returned to the conference room. She had barely slept. Her board chair had called 3 times. Her largest shareholder had threatened to replace her. The business press was beginning to report that the deal was in trouble. She walked into that glass-walled room knowing she had 1 hour to perform a miracle, and she had no idea how. The partners filed in looking grim. No one made small talk. The interpreters took their positions, but everyone knew they were inadequate for what was needed. Victoria stood at the head of the table. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you for returning this morning. I know yesterday was frustrating. I know we faced challenges in communication that made real progress impossible. I want to address those challenges directly. Werner Hoffman leaned back in his chair. Miss Sterling, with all respect, more speeches will not solve our problem. You're right, Victoria said. Speeches won't. And I'll be honest, I don't have a perfect solution. But I believe this merger represents tremendous value for all of our companies. I believe we're close to agreement on the core issues. And I believe that if we can find a way to truly understand each other, we can close this deal today. How? Isabelle Marchand asked, her skepticism evident. Your technology failed. Your interpreters are skilled but overwhelmed. Unless you have suddenly discovered someone who speaks all of our languages fluently and understands international business deeply, I do not see how this changes. The door to the conference room opened. Marcus Thompson walked in, carrying a leather portfolio. Victoria turned, startled. Thompson, I'm in a meeting. What are you? Forgive the interruption, Marcus said quietly. Then he spoke again, but this time in German, his words flowing with perfect fluency. Herr Hoffmann, I believe yesterday you were concerned about governance structures and how they reflect the strategic value of the German division. Is that correct? Werner Hoffmann's eyes widened. He responded in German, rapid and complex. Marcus answered in the same language, his accent flawless, his vocabulary technical and precise. The conversation lasted 30 seconds. Then Werner leaned back, a look of surprise on his face. Marcus turned to Isabelle Marchand and switched to French, his pronunciation Parisian perfect. Madame Marchand, if I understand correctly, your concern is less about the specific percentages and more about ensuring that European perspectives are genuinely integrated into decision-making processes. Yes? Isabelle responded in French, her words coming fast. Marcus listened carefully, then replied. They spoke for nearly a minute, discussing nuances of corporate governance and cultural integration. When they finished, Isabelle looked at Marcus with new respect. He continued around the table. To Hiroshi Tanaka, he spoke Japanese, addressing concerns about implementation timelines and respecting the particular way Japanese business culture approached long-term partnerships. To Viktor Petrov, he spoke Russian, acknowledging historical concerns about Western business practices and the need for transparent accountability. To Chen Wei, he spoke Mandarin, discussing intellectual property protections through the lens of Chinese market realities. To Roberto Silva, he spoke Portuguese, addressing Brazilian regulatory environments and regional growth opportunities. To Ahmed al-Rashid, he spoke Arabic, touching on the importance of relationship building and trust in Middle Eastern business traditions. Each conversation was different. Marcus wasn't just translating, he was thinking in each language, understanding the cultural assumptions embedded in every concern. He was doing what the interpreters couldn't do, translating not just words, but entire frameworks of meaning. The conference room had fallen completely silent. Everyone was staring at Marcus. Victoria felt like the floor had vanished beneath her. She was looking at her driver, the man she had dismissed, mocked, ignored, and she was seeing him for the first time. Marcus finished his conversation with Ahmed and turned to Victoria. In English, he said quietly, Miss Sterling. I believe if you address 3 specific concerns, this deal can move forward. First, the German delegation needs explicit confirmation that their engineering standards will be maintained globally. Second, the French and Japanese groups need a cultural liaison position established at the board level, someone who ensures regional perspectives are integrated into strategy. Third, all delegations need a clear escalation process for disputes that doesn't default to American legal frameworks. Victoria stared at him. Her mind was reeling. Who are you? She whispered. I'm your driver, ma'am, Marcus said simply. But I used to be something else. And right now, if you'll allow me, I think I can help you save this deal. The room remained frozen. Then Werner Hoffmann began to laugh. It was a genuine laugh, full of surprise and respect. Miss Sterling, where have you been hiding this man? This is exactly what we needed yesterday. Isabelle Marchand nodded slowly. If Mr. Thompson can truly facilitate this negotiation, not just translate, but help us understand each other, then perhaps we have a chance. Victoria looked at Marcus, really looked at him. She saw the gray in his temples, the quiet strength in his posture, the intelligence in his eyes that she had somehow never noticed before. She saw someone who had walked into the room and, in less than 5 minutes, accomplished what her team of expensive interpreters couldn't achieve in hours. She felt shame, hot and sharp. She felt wonder. She felt the vertigo of realizing that everything she had believed about this man, about hierarchy, about worth, about who deserved respect, was catastrophically wrong. Mr. Thompson, she said, her voice unsteady. Would you be willing to help us? Marcus met her eyes. For a long moment, he didn't answer. Victoria held her breath. She had treated him with contempt. She had mocked his accent. She had dismissed him as beneath her notice. And now her entire career depended on his willingness to save her. Yes, Marcus said finally. I'll help. The next 4 hours were unlike anything Victoria had ever experienced. Marcus didn't just translate, he conducted the negotiation like a symphony. He moved around the table, sitting beside each delegation in turn, speaking their language, understanding their concerns, finding the places where interests aligned. He identified the gaps between what people were saying and what they meant. He clarified misunderstandings before they hardened into deal breakers. He found compromises that honored everyone's core needs. When the German team worried about engineering standards, Marcus helped them articulate exactly what those standards meant and why they mattered. Then he translated that concern to the other delegations in a way that made sense within their cultural frameworks. He showed how standardization could benefit everyone, how it was about excellence rather than control. When the Japanese delegation expressed reservations about timeline, Marcus recognized that the concern wasn't really about scheduling, it was about the Japanese business principle of nemawashi, the careful consensus building that couldn't be rushed. He helped Victoria and the other partners understand why pushing for quick decisions would undermine long-term success. They adjusted the implementation schedule to include proper consultation periods. When Viktor Petrov raised questions about financial transparency, Marcus understood the historical context: decades of Western companies making promises to Russian partners and then failing to honor them. He helped craft accountability mechanisms that addressed those wounds without insulting anyone's integrity. Every conversation was delicate. Every translation required more than linguistic accuracy, it required empathy, cultural knowledge, and deep understanding of how power and meaning move through language. Marcus had all of it. He had spent decades studying exactly this. And now, finally, he was using everything he had learned. Victoria watched in amazement. She had built her career on being the smartest person in the room, the one who saw angles others missed, the one who closed impossible deals. But watching Marcus work, she realized she had been operating with massive blind spots. She had never truly understood how much could be lost in translation. How much damage could be done by assuming everyone thought the way she did. How much wisdom existed in perspectives she had never bothered to consider. By 3 p.m, the major obstacles had been resolved. The equity structure was rebalanced in a way that satisfied all parties. The intellectual property protections were strengthened with input from the Chinese and Japanese legal experts. The governance structure included the cultural liaison position, which would rotate among representatives from different regions. The implementation timeline honored the need for proper consultation. At 4:30, Werner Hoffman stood and extended his hand to Victoria. "Miss Sterling, I believe we have a deal." One by one, the other partners agreed. They would need to formalize everything in writing, of course. Lawyers would spend weeks on the detailed contracts. But the fundamental agreement was there, sealed by handshakes and smiles, and thanks to Marcus' genuine mutual understanding. Victoria shook hands with each partner, accepting their congratulations. But her mind was elsewhere. She kept glancing at Marcus, who had quietly returned to the back of the room, standing by the door as if he were still just the driver waiting for instructions. When the partners finally departed, Victoria stood alone in the conference room with Jennifer and Marcus. Jennifer was crying with relief. Victoria was shaking. "Mr. Thompson," she said. Her voice broke on his name. "I need to understand. You speak 9 languages fluently. You understand international business at an expert level. You just negotiated a $2 billion deal. Who are you, really?" Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I was a professor of sociolinguistics. I specialized in diplomatic communication and cultural translation. I had a fellowship at Harvard. I consulted for the UN and several Fortune 500 companies. I published 4 books and 70 academic papers." Victoria felt the blood drain from her face. "You were Dr. Marcus Thompson. I read your book. The Space Between Words. It's considered the definitive text on intercultural negotiation." "Yes," he said simply. "But why? Why are you driving cars? Why didn't you tell anyone?" "I left that life behind after my wife and daughter died. I couldn't be that person anymore. Driving seemed simple. Quiet. It asked nothing of me except to be present and move from one place to another." Victoria felt tears starting. "And I treated you like a driver," Marcus finished gently. "Which is what I am now." "No," Victoria said, her voice fierce. "That's not what you are. You're a brilliant man who saved my company. Who saved my career. Who showed me." She stopped, struggling with the words. "Who showed me how blind I've been." Marcus looked at her with something like compassion. "Miss Sterling, you're not a bad person. You're a product of a system that teaches people to value certain things and dismiss others. But systems can change. People can change. If they want to." Victoria wiped her eyes, trying to regain some composure. "I want to change. I want to be better. And I want to make this right with you." She took a breath. "Dr. Thompson, I would like to offer you a position with Sterling Tech Solutions. Director of Global Communication and Cultural Integration. You would oversee all our international partnerships. You would ensure we never again almost destroy a deal because we couldn't understand each other. The salary would be $750,000 annually, plus equity." Marcus smiled, but it was tinged with sadness. "That's a generous offer, Miss Sterling. But I'm not ready to be that person again. Maybe someday. But not yet." "Then what can I do?" Victoria asked desperately. "How can I thank you?" How can I possibly repay what you've done? You can remember, Marcus said quietly. Remember that the person who serves your coffee might be a poet. The person who cleans your office might be an engineer who fell on hard times. The person you pass without seeing might be carrying wisdom you desperately need. You can remember that dignity isn't earned by position. It's inherent in being human. Victoria nodded, tears flowing freely now. I'll remember. I promise you, I'll remember. Marcus turned to leave. Victoria called after him. Will you still drive for me? He looked back, a slight smile on his face. If you still need a driver, yes. I'll drive for you. I do, Victoria said. I do need you. But not just as a driver. As someone who can see what I can't. As someone who can remind me when I'm being blind. Then I'll stay, Marcus said. For now. He left the conference room, and Victoria stood there, feeling like the entire world had tilted on its axis. She had walked into this trip believing she was exceptional, untouchable, superior. She had treated another human being as if he were invisible. And that invisible man had saved her from ruin. The story of the Sterling Tech Solutions merger spread quickly through business circles. The trade press reported on the successful close of the $2 billion deal, calling it a masterpiece of international negotiation. Victoria gave interviews crediting her team's thorough preparation and the partners' good faith. She didn't mention Marcus Thompson. He had asked her not to. But privately, Victoria's entire approach to leadership began to change. She started actually talking to the people who worked for her, not just the executives, but the assistants, and the maintenance staff, and the security guards. She discovered that her receptionist had a master's degree in electrical engineering from Cairo University but couldn't get it recognized in the United States. She learned that the man who cleaned her office was writing a novel. She found out that the woman who brought her coffee every morning was a former journalist from Venezuela who had fled political persecution. She hired the receptionist into the engineering department. She connected the custodian with a literary agent she knew. She helped the woman from Venezuela get a position in their media relations team. Word spread. Other employees started sharing their stories. The culture at Sterling Tech slowly shifted. Victoria implemented what she called the whole person initiative, creating paths for employees to be seen and valued for all of what they brought, not just their current job description. And through it all, Marcus continued to drive her car. But now, after morning meetings, Victoria would sometimes turn off the intercom partition and simply talk with him. She asked about his life, his experiences, his perspectives on problems she faced. He shared carefully, guardedly, but genuinely. 6 months after the Brussels negotiation, Victoria was invited to give a keynote address at the Global Business Leadership Conference in Singapore. She asked Marcus if he would come with her, not as a driver, but as a colleague. He declined, but he did agree to review her speech beforehand. She sat in his small apartment in Queens the first time she had ever visited where he lived, while he read through her notes. The apartment was modest but beautiful, full of books in multiple languages, photographs of a woman and a young girl who Victoria now knew were his wife and daughter. "It's a good speech," Marcus said finally. "But you're still focused too much on efficiency and profit. You're missing the heart of what matters." "Which is?" Victoria asked. "That every person you encounter is carrying an infinite universe inside them. Joys and sorrows you can't imagine. Talents and dreams that might change the world if given a chance. Your job isn't just to close deals. It's to create space where those universes can exist, can flourish, can contribute." Victoria wrote his words down verbatim and made them the core of her speech. When she delivered it in Singapore, standing before 2,000 business leaders, she finally told the story of Brussels. She told them about her driver who spoke 9 languages. About her blindness and her shame. About how close she had come to losing everything because she couldn't see the value in someone who didn't fit her narrow definition of important. "I challenge you," she concluded, "to look around your organizations and ask, who am I not seeing? Who have I rendered invisible by my assumptions? Because I promise you, the person you're overlooking might be the one who saves you when everything falls apart." The speech went viral. Victoria received criticism from some quarters people who thought she was being too progressive, too soft, too focused on social issues rather than shareholder value. But she also received thousands of messages from people who said she had given voice to something they had long felt but couldn't articulate. Marcus watched the video of her speech alone in his apartment. He felt proud of her, this woman who had been so blind but who was genuinely trying to see. He thought about Sarah and Lily, about how much they would have liked this version of Victoria Sterling. And he thought about himself, about whether he might someday be ready to fully step back into the world he had left behind. Not yet. But maybe someday. One evening, a year after Brussels, Victoria and Marcus sat in the car after a particularly long day. Rain drummed on the roof, just like that night in Manhattan that had started everything. Thompson, Victoria said. She still called him that, mostly. Sometimes Dr. Thompson, when she was feeling formal. Never Marcus. That familiarity hadn't been earned yet, and she knew it. Yes, Miss Sterling? Do you ever forgive me? For how I treated you? He was quiet for a long time. There's nothing to forgive, he said finally. You were who you were. You're becoming who you'll be. That's all anyone can do. I want to be better, she said. Every day, I want to be better. Then you will be, Marcus said gently. Growth is a choice we make over and over again. They sat in comfortable silence as the rain fell and the city glowed around them. A powerful woman and a quiet man, both carrying their own wounds, both trying to move through the world with more grace than before. And somewhere in the space between them, in that place where understanding lived beyond words. Where respect transcended hierarchy. Where two people could finally see each other as human, something like hope took root and began to grow. Marcus Thompson would continue driving for Victoria Sterling for 3 more years. Eventually, he did accept a consulting position with her company, working remotely on international partnerships, helping bridge divides before they became crises. He never fully returned to academia, but he began writing again, publishing essays about loss and reinvention and the unexpected places where we find redemption. Victoria never forgot the lesson of that rainy night in Brussels, when her entire world nearly collapsed because she couldn't see the treasure standing right in front of her. She built a company that valued the whole person. She mentored young executives to look beyond the obvious. She donated millions to programs helping refugees and immigrants get their credentials recognized in new countries. She never became perfect. She still made mistakes, still had moments of blindness, still struggled with the arrogance that had once defined her. But she tried. Every day, she tried. And in the end, that's what the story was really about. Not a miraculous rescue or a dramatic reversal. But the ongoing work of becoming more human. Of learning to see. Of understanding that everyone we meet is carrying universes we can't imagine, and our job is simply to honor that infinite complexity with our attention, our respect, and our humility. The $2 billion deal was just money. The real treasure was learning how to recognize worth when it came dressed in unexpected clothes, speaking with an unfamiliar accent, sitting in the driver's seat of a limousine on a rainy New York night. That lesson, Victoria would carry for the rest of her life. And it made all the difference.